I'm not exactly sure what I want to talk about today. It's 9:30 p.m., so I do have some time to talk to myself, so I will take the opportunity. And first I want to share another sign that I've switched into the more energetic state of consciousness where history doesn't bother me so much, and those who represent history. I've been wearing this deodorant for the last few months and not really caring that it doesn't really work very well, though it does smell good. I love the smell by Essence Aromatherapy Breeze. It's the bergamot. It smells good on the stick, but after a few hours on my armpits don't smell good. So I went out to London Drugs and got this super potent stuff. It's very chemically. It's not like an eco brand of any kind, but it's the one toxic product that I use because otherwise it just doesn't really work very well. So I've been hugging people like this for months. Now with this, I can definitely do the full-on hug, or like this kind of hug or that kind of hug. It'll all be okay. They changed the smell and the packaging, and I like the smell. Shower fresh. And I put it on earlier today. Yeah, it's pretty good. Way better than the other stuff. So when I have that extra energy, I start to make these changes towards taking care of myself just a little bit better. Because I have the energy to do so. It's not like I have to think about it. I just do it, and then I notice that. And I have been taking 1/3 of a Zopiclone. This one kind of crumbled up, so I put it in an empty capsule. Wait, where's the camera? Oh, there it is. But I feel a little bit less rested taking this amount, but I think it's for the best if I taper off this stuff, at least for a while. And I've been taking half a Benadryl and 150 milligrams of trazodone, and then 125 of quetiapine. And yesterday I started researching a little bit about oxytocin. I have it here on my wall. Oxytocin. So it has glycine, can't really read that, leucine, wait, is that leucine? Yeah, proline, cysteine, tyrosine, isoleucine, glutamine, asparagine, and proline. I think I got that already. So there's a ring here, and then there's this little tail. So I was looking up all these different amino acids that make up oxytocin, and I was thinking, well, I could start taking some of these amino acids. I already take glycine, I already take tyrosine, I take N-acetylcysteine, which is the cysteine. I don't take leucine or asparagine or glutamine or isoleucine. So I was looking those up on Amazon to see if they're available. And just so you know, dopamine is very simple. And it looks kind of like, dopamine's very simple, and it looks kind of like tyrosine. Whereas again, oxytocin is very complex. So I was looking up the oxytocin molecules, and they have a bunch of them. They have all of them on Amazon except for asparagine. But you can get D-aspartic acid. And then I was thinking, well, I still have these from Hardy Nutritionals. And I looked at the bottle, and it has isoleucine, leucine, other ones that aren't part of oxytocin. It has the glutamine, aspartic acid, proline, taurine's not part of it. Tyrosine, but I already take tyrosine. See, tyrosine. Glycine, gravel suppositories for emergency use if I can't sleep, and taurine. And since I don't eat meat, I felt like I could start taking a little bit of this stuff again, separately, not as part of the Hearty Nutritionals program, but just to make sure I have all those other amino acids needed to make oxytocin. I was thinking of making a formulation with these ones in it, but I don't really need to do that right now. I can use up my bottles of this. When I used to take this in the Hearty Nutritionals program, I think it was taking 12 a day, and I only took 2 yesterday and 2 today in the morning without food. Just to make sure I have all these amino acids. It's not good to have too many of the branched chain amino acids. Well, it is to some extent, but actually isoleucine and leucine are both branched chain amino acids. So yeah, I'm going to use up some of this, and I have my tyrosine that I have been taking lately. This is the stuff that makes dopamine, because look how similar it is, very similar. Tyrosine has only 1 hydroxyl group, dopamine has 2, so it looks like this sort of does one of those carboxylation, trans-carboxylation things or something. I'm just making this up. I did study organic chemistry, but I can't remember. So, and then it turns to dopamine, see? So, yeah, for some reason I was looking that up, and I'm going to take a little bit of the amino acids just to make sure I have everything in case my brain wants to amp up on the oxytocin, because the good energy is coming in, so I have to make sure that I have enough nutrition. And in researching the seizures and the epilepsy, I took a couple notes about how it says after a seizure, the person will have depleted nutrients because the seizure utilizes a lot of nutrients, and then there's not enough. So I'm theorizing that the same thing, similar process, could happen to somebody who goes into mania, and it could be that the brain goes into a different type of electrical storm, which isn't a seizure, but it is heightened energy in the brain, and that energy is there to maybe provide a blueprint for other molecules to be made. But if we don't have the right ingredients, or if we run out, then it's not going to happen. So that's why I feel like making sure I have enough nutrition so the intelligence of my biochemistry can do what it needs to do with that nutrition. And also, a friend of mine sent me a couple of quotes by Joseph Campbell, and there were a couple that kind of stuck out in my brain, and what I realized was that Joseph Campbell in these quotes is making the leap from mysticism to madness. I don't like the word madness, but you know, people taking LSD, it's a similar phenomenon to, say, schizophrenia. But that type of extrapolation isn't usually made. And before I read these quotes, before my friend sent me these quotes, I wrote down to myself that a lot of times in the past I've said that certain people aren't making the leap between these things. Like, these pathological phenomena as being an extension of what we can do with exogenous substances like LSD or different hallucinogens. And when it's triggered internally or by the universe, we don't really have control over the length of time that it's going to happen. And then when we can't control it, and it eventually gets to be scary, then we end up pathologized. So in the past, I'm like, well, this person isn't making that leap in this book, and this one's not like making the leap in that book. One book that I did see them making that sort of leap was called The Possibility Principle. And when I was writing in my book the other day, I wrote down, wait a minute, I'm saying there's a link to human potential. I'm saying there's a link to what have you. So maybe not many people are really saying that or pointing to that, but I'm pointing to it. So why would I be mad if other people aren't saying it? Because that's what I'm trying to show. So if people haven't chosen to show that, and unless they've been through this type of thing, I don't think they would have much reason or context or lived experience to really provide the necessary motivation to talk about these things. So who cares if nobody else is making that link? And I'm sure there are lots of people, but I haven't found them yet. That's what I'm saying, is there's a human potential element in this. And one of the quotes by Joseph Campbell, who I haven't really studied, but he says, quote, "The psychotic drowns in the same waters in which the mystic swims with delight." So it's the same kind of waters, but we haven't really figured out how to navigate it. And then another one was that, and then to go with that, it's like, well, how do you stop from drowning? And I think that's what I've been learning over the years, is how to stop from drowning. And then another quote by Joseph Campbell is a longer one. It's, "The LSD phenomenon, on the other hand, is, to me at least, more interesting," to Joseph Campbell. "It is intentionally achieved schizophrenia with the expectation of a spontaneous remission, which, however, does not always follow." So he's saying you take LSD, you kind of get an intentional schizophrenia with the expectation of spontaneous remission, with the expectation that it will go away. And then he says yoga too is intentional schizophrenia. One breaks away from the world, plunging inward, and the ranges of vision experienced are in fact the same as those of a psychosis. But what then is the difference? What is the difference between a psychotic or LSD experience and a yogic or mystical? The plunges are all into the same deep inward sea. Of that there can be no doubt. The symbolic figures encountered are in many instances identical, and I shall have something more to say about those in a moment. But there is an important difference. The difference, to put it sharply, is equivalent simply to that between a diver who can swim and one who cannot. The mystic is endowed with native talents for this sort of thing, and following, stage by stage, the instruction of a master, enters the waters and finds he can swim. Whereas a schizophrenic, unprepared, unguided, and ungifted, has fallen or has intentionally plunged and is drowning. So that's similar to the shorter quote, but it seems that obviously Joseph Campbell is making that leap. He's not really making the leap to the human potential movement, but in a way he is, by comparing schizophrenia with a mystic and just saying that the difference is that mystic can swim, often because they've been taught by some kind of master. A lot of times a person who gets into mysticism might already be studying with a master, and then the mysticism starts happening, and then they're able to navigate it with the help of a master. But that's not necessarily the way it happens with schizophrenia. Maybe we need masters more than we need people to pathologize us. That'd be nice. It's like, hey, you have schizophrenia, you have bipolar. Here is a spiritual master to be part of your team. And eventually, as you learn to swim, you'll be able to take off the training wheels of these brain tranquilizers. These tranquilizers that lower your brain function. That was something interesting that I read by reading the stuff on epilepsy, is that from a book on the GAPS diet, which I got because it's related to mental health and it has a section on epilepsy, apparently. It said the epileptic drugs are like brain tranquilizers. They reduce brain function. They don't fix the symptoms. They just basically lower the functioning of the brain. And I think that's what the psych meds do too. And it makes sense too, because I feel oftentimes these extraordinary and extreme and altered states and non-ordinary states are giving us clues to other capacities our brain has. So by taking meds that lower brain capacity, it not only takes away the capacities that the brain cells were exploring, but also lowers it below the capacity that it had before the problem started. Like people, before that trouble started, they might have at least been able to stay awake during the day, and then they take these psych meds or epileptic drugs, and then they're falling asleep all day long, so less functioning. And so it makes sense as to why that's partly why people sometimes have less executive function, because these meds are lowering brain functioning, but they usually are like, oh, it's a part of the illness. I don't know if that's true or not. It could be partly true, because I feel that these extraordinary states are trying to give the brain access to other areas of the brain, or other algorithms, or other firing patterns, or ripples, or what have you. And in that way, some of our executive functions could start getting tied into those brain states, because most of it is tied into the prefrontal cortex. But if other patterns start happening, some of the functioning could be trying to tie into that. Like, I feel that the brain is trying to operate in a more holistic way, in a more world-centric way, in a way that would have us cooperate with each other and not compete as separate selves, as it's not sustainable. So then it puts the separate self functioning of the prefrontal cortex offline. And then when we're in that altered state, we still have access to functioning. But then when the energy goes away, we've lost what we started with too. But we can learn, I feel, to still divert those functionings to other areas of the brain. And I think that's really important, because if we try to get the prefrontal cortex part online, that's all tied into the notion of a separate self, which isn't real. So when our executive functioning has diminished, and this notion of acting like a separate self, even if we're more like a zombie, we probably are more in touch with actuality, and that we're not acting in that way that it's the way we've been conditioned to function, the way we've been educated to function, but it's not really real. So, and it was interesting. Today I was listening to Steve Pavlina's Deep Abundance Integration call number 20, day 20 in a row, and he usually talks for about an hour. And he was saying, he was giving a bit of a theory or a possibility or a hypothesis of, he talks about reality as a simulator. And he was saying that what he's noticed for himself in his own experimentation of his own consciousness is that if he's outside, he's taking the subjective reality perspective, or he was noticing when he was lucid dreaming, when he was outside, the dream characters that would come to him would be kind of boring. But if he was able to lucid dream and put himself in a blank room with a few people, they got into this really deep conversation. So this is lucid dreaming. And then he tried to, well, he extrapolated that to actual reality, waking life, and the possibility that it's a simulator. And that if it is a simulator, it has certain constraints on how much it can calculate. So he was trying to make the point, okay, if I'm outside, the simulator has more to render. So it takes more processing power. So the brain has to render more. Whereas if he is in a blank room, like his office with a blank wall, he says he gets better ideas because he's theorizing because there's not so much to render. So he's talking about like simplicity in one's working space. Mine's not very simple. There's stuff all over in here. And I'm not talking about this to tell what he was saying about his theories, but I realized it was kind of similar to, you know me, I'm always extrapolating. So what I realized was when a person is in so-called mania, they're outside and it's beautiful and they're talking to people and it's complex and we're more natural and nothing's a problem, and we go on like that for a period of time, whether it's months or weeks or years, I don't know. And then it's like the history, that which wants to recondition us back into the old way of operation. You know, we end up in like a sterile psych ward. We end up in like a panic room in a psych ward and then admitted to the ward with these blank walls. And when we're out in mania in the world, we're like having these light conversations and everything's pretty much synchronistic and magical. And then it's like the brain can't render that anymore. Maybe it's run out of the capacity to move into that type of way of being. Just like we can't sleep forever. So we sleep for say 8 hours, 10 hours, we get up and we are awake. Well, this whole like manic thing is sort of a different type of cycle, which could go on for days and weeks and months, but it eventually has to go back to sleep or go back to a lower processing. So we go from this infinite, beautiful, heaven-like realm with wonderful people and magical things happening, and eventually, if it switches to psychosis or we get out of control somehow, you know, the powers that be capture us and throw us in this little blank room. And now it's almost like that is a congruent or parallel, that's parallel to the functioning of the brain. So the brain was able to render this magical heavenly world in mania and had all this processing power to do so. And when it runs out of the processing power, we're in this room. When our processing power is so low, we end up in this blank room with maybe one psychiatrist asking us questions about our symptoms, when before we were just in this world of heaven and we were interacting with people and having a good time. So to me, he was sort of pointing to something that happens in actual reality of people who get diagnosed. They end up in these low processing, sterile rooms. And then instead of having these playful conversations with strangers out in mania, in heaven, kind of, we're in this room and we have this deep conversation with this very learned person who's there to condition us to believe that none of that was real. And really what's happened to us, who is experiencing this subjective change from subjectivity and almost dreaming while awake to being objectified as a mental patient and being told what to think. Before, in the subjective world of mania, we were making our own meaning and following it. And that creates behaviors that are probably quite different than our habitual programmed ones. And it seems we can only process like that for so long, and then it collapses in upon itself And when the brain can't process that much, we're in this very limited, sterile environment. And then we get conditioned as mental patients, and they eventually let us out to consensus reality, where we then interact with each other based on, I'm this object and you're this object, and we're these billiard balls in a Newtonian world, which isn't true. But what I've been realizing lately is both are true, and that's something that I think Steve Pavlina has helped with, now that he's experienced a mental health label. But he sort of plays with the subjective reality lens, and he uses the objective reality lens. But the difference for me in my experience in mental health is I'm plunged into the subjective reality lens by the universe for a certain period of time, and I'm not the one that's putting the different lenses on. The lens is put on me. But then realizing that other people are in the objective lens, and maybe not sharing so much of that subjectivity with others because they don't necessarily get it, though we think that they do. We think that they're a part of our dream, but really we're in this dream world and they're in an objective world. So realizing that other people likely have an objective lens. And that's pretty long-winded about that, but I thought it was interesting in terms of, one could think that literally after the mania stops, mania where the brain is at way higher energy, way faster speed, we are able to process so much more. And in that, we're able to manifest so much more beauty and creativity and experience life in a totally different way when the brain is energized like that. And when that energy is withdrawn, kind of like a tide, then all of a sudden we're just in this like very sterile environment. And then we're reconditioned to think in sort of a sterile way about ourselves, a conditioned way. And it's like that's the world the brain can manifest. But one can learn to do that oneself too, and just have a very simple place to go for a while, so then one doesn't get captured. Yeah, I don't know what I'm saying with that, but interestingly enough, I was talking to myself probably yesterday about how I feel like sometimes I'm speaking as my brain cells, like they're telling me what to say about how they work. So I'm trying in my clumsy way to put words to what might be happening at the level of my brain cells through these processes of non-ordinary states of consciousness and extreme states of consciousness and very energized and inspired states of consciousness. And from that experience, in retrospect, I could sort of speak as my brain cells telling me what they experienced in a way. I don't know if it's really true. I can't see my brain cells, but I can try my best to speak what they might say. And then yesterday, I was watching this sort of cheesy old DVD that I got with my NEDAC rebounder, which is the mini trampoline. And I was watching it because I thought it would show the health bounce, which is just a little bounce that you do for health. And so I watched quite a bit of this presentation, which was really good, even though it was from 1992. It was still relevant and informative. And when the doctor guy was talking, he was saying in this part, unrelated to the trampoline, that he said, our cells understand English. Because he's talking about the cells. And, rebounding is cellular exercise and blah, blah, blah. But he was talking about other stuff related to cells. And he was saying, the worst thing you can do is tell someone, like, you have cancer and you have 6 months to live, like a doctor. Because he said, cells listen to authority. So they'll kind of be like, okay, well, I'm going to be out of a job in 6 months. This is what that doctor guy was saying. So then they kind of know that that's the end of their life based on what the doctor said. So his point was cells understand English. Well, I immediately thought to myself, since I just said this to myself the day before, I thought they probably speak it too. They probably don't just understand it, they probably speak it. And that's the point I was trying to make, is that the brain cells can speak English as themselves, and other parts of the body too. Yeah. So I made a note of that, and I'm going to check off that I talked about it, because I have this whole book full of notes and another notebook full. The best is yet to come. Can you hear that, cells? Can you understand that, cells? The best is yet to come. And don't let dreams be dreams. And the universe, I got you. So that's the messages I try to send to my cells. And when I send them messages, they send me messages back. And there is no me. I'm just a bunch of cells. And that bunch of cells together speaks English. So the individual cells, I feel, can speak English too. And that's how they talk, speaking as the cells. And I already talked about that. So the guy on this NEDAC Rebounder DVD said serious diagnosis impairs the immune system because cells communicate with each other. So if they can communicate, I'm sure they can have that level up to the level of human communication, because they're what makes us up as humans. So, maybe the words come right out of the DNA. We don't really know. And I remember once reading somewhere that there was like a single nucleotide mutation that led to the arising of language. I don't know if it was like Richard Dawkins' work or something. I haven't read his stuff really, because from what I've heard about it, it seems kind of strange, but I think he talks a lot about memes and replicating memes, so that could be good. But this doctor on this NEDAC DVD was also talking about cellular environment in terms of water. But I was thinking for myself about cellular environment in terms of the vibration of sound, or the different vibes that are in the brain. So is the brain being bathed in a bunch of repetitive thoughts? And I realized that a lot of the time my brain cells are bathed in meaning that eyes can see in a creative perception. So it's something new and subjectively meaningful. And it's not bathed in the vibration of thoughts that I've been programmed with. It's creating new meaning, which makes life feel subjectively meaningful. And the more subjective meaning we feel, and the more we have, and the more we can create it, and the more we know we can create it in the future, even if we're not able to create it right now, say if we're in a, quote, depression or something, it gives hope for feeling some kind of meaningful life at some point, because we have that capacity. We don't have to rely on finding that meaning in repetition, which can never be meaningful. So, yeah, and then on this NEDAC DVD, now whenever I share something about what somebody else said, I'm usually going to extrapolate that to my own context, which doesn't usually have a ton to do with what the person originally said. And so he was talking about exercise as the common denominator of exercise being opposing gravity. So like repetitions of dumbbells or squats or something like that, opposing gravity. And then he brought up the point that the body cannot tell the difference between acceleration and deceleration and gravity. So not that it's the same thing. He was saying acceleration, like putting the pedal to the metal, is real, and putting the brakes on, deceleration, is real, and it's felt as we put the brakes on, we lean forward. We step on the pedal, we lean back. But the body doesn't know about that, the difference between that and gravity, which is, the force of up and down. Or it's not a force. Yeah, it is a force, the force of gravity. So I wanted to extrapolate this to something I've thought about before, which is how the field of consciousness could be similar to the field of gravity, or part of the field of gravity, entangled with it, or it could be just similar in that it's a field of some kind of force. And I was realizing that in a way, when a person's brain speeds up and goes into mania, consciousness has kind of sped up. And then when we slow down and we're starting to slow down and reattach to the old paradigm way of the brain working, we're decelerating. Okay, so the field of consciousness is sort of like a field from, say, fear and the lower states to higher state of love. So fear to love, and there's this field of consciousness. So when we're accelerating in consciousness, pretend it's like a vertical axis, we feel this love. And then when we start to decelerate, we feel it as fear. So what I'm trying to say is, if consciousness is a field like gravity from love to fear, then it could also be possible, because the field of gravity is like this, and we can't tell the difference between acceleration and deceleration along a vertical axis, or maybe in an elevator. The body can't tell the difference between that and gravity. So what I'm saying is that it could be similar, that we can't really tell that we're going up and down in consciousness, because it's more of an acceleration forward and then a deceleration back. But that's the same as the field of consciousness. That's the same way we experience it. And that might not be a very good illustration, but I think that what it's saying too is, when we speed up, we, in so-called mania or higher states or more energetic states of the brain, we feel this love. We don't feel it as accelerating. Just like, if we're accelerating in a car, we feel the pressure of our back on the seat, but the body might just feel a change in gravity. It can't tell the difference. We might know the difference because our eyes are open, but what I'm trying to point to is that I feel that there's something going on in terms of an acceleration in consciousness and a deceleration in consciousness. And the acceleration is felt as love, and the deceleration is felt as fear, which is like the same as some kind of pressure on the back, maybe making us lean forward. So if we can't tell that we're really speeding up or slowing down, this could be the point. I'm seeing this right now. This could be the key point. I'm talking to myself here, is that in the so-called bipolar, for example, using that word very lightly, the brain speeds up, it accelerates in consciousness and has a higher energy level. And then it slows down, we experience fear, and it's decelerating in consciousness, or sort of going backwards. But this is the trick that happens, is we might actually feel like we're going up in the levels of consciousness in the field. That's like, I said vertical before, but I went like this, I meant horizontal. So anyway, we might think that we're accelerating or going up the scale of consciousness vertically, like we get to the height of love and we think, I'm God, or I'm the savior, or I'm going to save the world. And really we're accelerating. So we're experiencing that same thing. We're not really going up the levels. So this could actually relate to what Joseph Campbell said about the mystic swimming delightfully in the same water that this person with schizophrenia drowns in. So the thing is, we might be accelerating in bipolar mania or certain altered states in schizophrenia, but we might actually think we're transcending the levels of consciousness and think, I'm God forever, I'm going to save the world, but we can't maintain it. And we can't maintain it because really our brains had the gas pedal stepped on, and then it starts to slow down at a certain point because, there could be energetic or nutritional or like objective physical type barriers to maintain that. Just like if we're accelerating in a car, we can't necessarily accelerate forever. There's a top speed that the vehicle's going to reach, and then it's just going to stay there, and then there's no more acceleration. And then we decelerate and we eventually stop. So we could be mistaking the spiritual journey that one might go through with the help of a master through some kind of mystical path of like transcending the levels of consciousness, like Dr. David Hawkins talks about. But then there could be this other way that it happens, that we accelerate, the brain accelerates, so we think that we're transcending, but really the brain is just sped up temporarily. So we need to possibly take what we experience with a grain of salt or something, because it's not going to be maintained. And maybe certain mystics are able to maintain it, but it's not necessarily bad that it's going to be not maintained, because if we accelerate forever and other people's brains aren't accelerating, then they're not necessarily moving at the same speed we are. So we accelerate and then we decelerate. We kind of go like this when other people are sort of trotting along at like a brain speed that is a little bit slower, because people's brains have been conditioned to move pretty close to the same speed, at the speed of repetitious thought, which is a mediocre limited thing. And I feel that people whose brains speed up, they go beyond that. That's probably why people talk faster, etc. It's because their brain is speeded up so we can talk faster. Or we're perceived as talking faster because the brain is accelerating. And I actually feel that people who have a lot of conditioned thought and don't see and perceive creatively and see new things that create new thoughts or insights, it's almost like the same as taking a tranquilizer. One is being tranquilized with repetitious thought. It's like being on a treadmill versus being in a race car. So people are on their treadmill, and then when we start to accelerate, you can't, if the treadmill is going one speed, a person can't accelerate, they'll run off the end of the treadmill. And so people with thought, like repetitions, like, what am I going to do today? What am I going to eat tonight? Oh, this happened yesterday. I don't like myself. That person's this person's that. La 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 la. It's like moving at the speed of human thought. And then when the brain speeds up, a lot of times we talk faster because we're having a lot more insight and ideas come to mind. And a lot of times it's nonsensical because there's a lot of it that's really new. And that's why we sound different and kind of non-coherent. It's coherent in our own inner subjectivity. and our brain's moving faster, but to get it out objectively doesn't really happen on the first try. It usually just gets us imprisoned psychiatrically. So I don't know what else. I'm going to look at what else I want to talk about today.